Well, I think probably most of you have met me or seen me around in some context, but if you haven't, my name's Emma. I'm the Science Network Coordinator for UCCF, and it's an absolute joy to welcome you guys to the last Science Network event of term. We're joined by Professor Justin Barrett, and we're going to be looking at the question, is my faith just a byproduct of evolution? That's a huge one, isn't it? I don't know how we can do it justice in the kind of just over an hour that we've got, but we can certainly make a start. What we're going to do is we'll hear from Justin for kind of 40 minutes or so after you've got to know him a bit. Then we'll have some time for Q&A. So on that same Slido that we just had the poll, there's space for you to ask questions. So do be submitting those throughout the talk, and then we'll come to them at the end. Now, just so you guys know, this is being recorded. You can probably see that little light on. So if you'd really rather not have your face on camera, just turn your camera off. Otherwise, it's quite nice having cameras on. It means we can see who's here and interact with each other a little bit more. So do leave them on if you're comfortable with that. So that's, I think, all that I've got to say to kick us off. We should be done by kind of 6:15 if you've got other things you need to get off to. Well, Justin, it'd be great to get to know you a little bit. First of all, where in the world are you calling in from?
I am calling in from Knoxville, Tennessee in the United States. I know this is a little part that most people probably don't know. It's in the Eastern time zone, but nowhere near the ocean. So kind of in the middle, so Middle East there, except that's not a real word, but that's where I am.
So what time is it for you at the minute?
It is just afternoon here. Okay. So I'm starting to feel peckish and, I'll get hangry later on. So hopefully that won't influence the question and answer too much.
Yeah, great. Better make sure we finish on time or you won't get your lunch. So Justin, you're a psychologist by training. Can you tell us a bit about what your career in science has looked like? How did you get from like being an undergraduate, like most of these guys are here, to where you are now in your career?
Oh, the long and winding road. I did it all wrong. As an undergraduate, I was fascinated by, I actually started as a biology major because I was just always fascinated by the natural world. And then I discovered the scientific side of psychology. And I made a switch because I thought human minds and behavior, that's even more complicated than biology. I'm not sure if it is or not, but it sure seemed like it at the time. But so I jumped into that and at some point decided I wanted to do this professionally and went to graduate school, Cornell University it was called human experimental psychology to distinguish it from the psychology of animals. And then I've ended up teaching and doing things in various disciplines all over the place. Calvin University, I taught there, University of Michigan. I did 5 years teaching in the School of Anthropology at Oxford. So I spent some time in the UK. In fact, while I was there, I started the Institute for Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology, along with Robin Dunbar and Harvey Whitehouse. We did that. And then taught at Fuller's Theological Seminary in the School of Psychology for 9 years. And now I'm a free agent. I've just started my own little foundation to try to encourage the integration of faith and theology with the sciences. It's called Blueprint 1543. And so that's what I'm doing now. So I've been in and out of academia in various ways, did some youth ministry in there for a while, stayed at home, homeschooled my kids while my wife was working, all kinds of things. So nothing very neat and tidy.
Okay, so if you want to find out more about what Justin's doing now, Google Blueprint 1543 and you'll find some more information about that. Now, Justin, without giving too much away on what you're about to speak on, what have been some of the kind of key interests and motivations behind what you've worked on over those years?
Yeah, well, even as an undergraduate, it was clear to me that, from my faith background, that religious concepts are really important to people. How they think about God is really important to people. Whether or not they believe in God, how they think about God, it can be very important. And yet it was a very understudied area, at least from a scientific perspective. So the psychology of religion, while it's been with us for 100 years, had only lightly been sort of dipping into what we might call the cognitive or cognitive science side of things. But that's because the cognitive sciences really are kind of just now maturing, or back then, I guess, where they were just maturing. And so I thought, hey, let's look at religious concepts, even though I didn't really know many people doing it from the cognitive perspective. And then there's this sort of dirty little secret of how I got into this, and that's that I don't like to read too much, or at least back then I didn't. And so it was really helpful to pick an area that was pretty new and there wasn't a lot of things written. So then I didn't have to read so much.
There's a tip to anyone who's considering a science career. Pick an area where you don't have to read too much. Okay, and finally, before I hand over to you, why is it that you're so excited about Christians like these guys going into the sciences?
There's an awful lot of work to be done, right? If this year has taught us nothing else, there's a lot of scientific work that matters to the world at large. At least from my perspective, the science and science-related technologies are some of the most important culture shapers on Earth. And I'm not alone in this. There are a lot of people, scholars now saying that we're entering this sort of new age in the history of the universe, if you will, at least this part of the universe, that like never before, humans get to change their environment for themselves and for everything else. And we're doing that through our science-based technologies. And yet, people of faith are way underrepresented in those areas, way underrepresented. I mean, we're probably globally missing at least 1 million scientists, to put it in perspective, and especially at that top tier. And even when we do have believers in the sciences, we often feel this tendency to sort of box out there, put our faith over on the shelf and then do the science instead of bringing the two together and integrating those. And it's that integrated selves, those integrated selves we need of Christ followers in this space so that we approach problems in new ways and offer the world a broader menu of options for solving the problems that we face. So that's kind of why we're excited about it. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, great. Well, I'll hand over to you for the next 40 minutes or so. I'll pop myself on mute and then we'll come back in kind of 40 minutes for some Q&A time. So over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Emma. I appreciate it. I know our time is short. And so I know that you're coming from a lot of different kinds of backgrounds. And so what I have decided I'd like to do is organize my comments around, you might think of this as my 12 days of Christmas talk, except that I'm only going to look at 5 days, the final 5. So, from 5 golden rings to, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. And for the occasion, I've worn this tie. So this is my 12 days of Christmas tie. I'll see if you can see it, but we're going to concentrate on this lower section here, starting with the rings and working our way down. And that's to give you just some key concepts to hang this discussion on, because as I was mentioning to Emma, this is a new area of science research. It's always changing. And so I could tell you, well, here's the state of the art, and here are the implications for the Christian faith or any other religious faith you like. And a year from now, I'll be out of date. So why do that to you? Instead, what I want to do is give you some conceptual framework to hang some details on as you run into these kinds of ideas in your science courses, in your continued study, in popular treatments of this sort, and so on. All right, so that's what I want to do. And I want to start with those 5 golden rings because they're going to apply probably to any kind of science area or question. Okay, by the 5 gold rings, I mean 5 ways one's faith matters to being an integrated scientist. And I'm going to start with those, and then the rest of the talk, I'll kind of flesh that out a little bit. So 5 gold rings. I guess I should do it this way though, because as scientists, we have our hands open, reaching forward, ready to receive new insights. We take a curious, outward reaching approach. And then we'll start counting then from the inside out on our fingers. We'll start with 2 different, well, some of you know that these 2 fingers on the inside then, the little one and the ring finger, right? They kind of are exercised by the same muscle. So that makes them kind of awkward to operate together. Well, my first 2 gold rings kind of go together. They're preliminaries, if you will. The first is, how do I pick my topic of study? Does my faith inform my topic of study? And let me suggest that it always will. Your faith or your worldview is going to impact what you decide to study, whether you know it or not. So you might as well be reflective and explicit about it. That'll help you out. Okay, so for me, because of my faith background, I recognize the importance of God concepts in people's lives, and that inspired me to go and study God concepts. And it might be a different issue for you. It might be environmental care. It might be medicine. It might be any number of things that somehow, because of who you are and your worldview, you're curious about. What's my topic of study? Can I integrate that? Second, what are my assumptions and commitments that I bring to this research question or problem? Again, whether we articulate them or not, we're going to bring some to us, whether we're going to just receive them passively from our mentors, from the labs we work in, whatever it is. There are assumptions and commitments brought to the problem. And for me, as a person, a Christ follower, I have to examine myself, for instance, to see, well, are the sciences the right tools for my research problem? Do they bring with them certain assumptions and commitments that are commensurate with my faith? And I think by and large, being a scientist is a pretty good game in this regard. At least these guys behind me, we've got Galileo and Francis Bacon, they thought that the Christian faith actually was a really good foundation for doing the sciences. And I haven't come across any good reasons to think they were wrong about that. Okay, so by and large, the sciences are great tools in our tool belt for trying to figure out what the world is and how it operates. But it's also my second gold ring, my assumptions and commitments brought to the problem also has to do with, well, what's the specific area of science that I might bring to this problem? Or are the sciences the right question? So, or the right tool for the question, I should say. So if it's a normative question, a moral question, for instance, maybe the sciences are going to help a little bit, but they can't operate all by themselves because the sciences don't tell us what we should do. They tell us, how things work, what things are, but they don't typically give us a whole lot of sort of straight on the chin information about what we should do. Okay. So topic of study, assumptions, commitments I bring to the problem. My third golden ring, methods. Now, this is much more important for those of us who work in the human sciences or animal sciences, because really but it applies everywhere. And that's you might think of this as research ethics. Are your methods commensurate with your faith? Are there something you can sort of, in doing your research, can you kind of, I don't know, look your ethics square in the eye and say, I'm doing a good job here. All right. And especially important when we're working with other humans. Are we treating our research participants well? Are we balancing sort of their rights and their dignity with the research process? All right. So topic of study, assumptions and commitments, methods. Fourth, interpretation and dissemination of results. What am I going to do with the results of my study? Most of the time I find in the work that I do, my disagreements with my colleagues who come from other worldviews actually ends up here in this space, is how we interpret our findings and what are we going to do about it? Who are we going to tell about it and how are we going to push it out there? Okay. So I like to say, in my area, I work in an area called cognitive science of religion. Most of the people who work in my area are not believers. In fact, most would say they are atheists. And most of the time we agree on the science. Where we disagree is what the implications of the science are. Okay, that's that fourth area. You with me? Sort of nod. I can see you guys. So, if you're, picking your nose or something, I can see that. So, all right. Some of you look way too serious though, but all right. There we go. All right, that's better. All right. Fifth, treatment of colleagues. The sciences, as you probably all are sort of quickly discovering, are collaborative enterprises. This is a social enterprise. We share ideas with each other. We share techniques. We share insights. We build off of each other. We compete with each other. We use peer review systems. We get money from funding bodies. We can't do it alone. There aren't any sort of giants out there who stood all by themselves and figured stuff out. That is not the world we live in. That's not how the sciences work. Well, then how are you going to treat your colleagues as a Christ follower? Is that going to be evident in how you treat your colleagues? Okay. So 5 things: topic of study, assumptions, commitments made to the problems, methods, interpretation of results, and treatment of colleagues. Those are 5 areas that I'm concerned with myself when I try to integrate my faith with being a scientist. Okay. And hopefully those will be ways to help you think about how you integrate your faith. Or if you aren't a person of faith, how you integrate your worldview with how you do your sciences. Is there a coherence there? Okay. If you don't remember anything else, remember those 5 things, those 5 gold rings. It's gold, man, it's gold. All right. Now, 4 calling birds. These are 4 key concepts or distinctions concerning human evolution that are just in the literature a lot, and they're going to help frame our discussion. Okay. The first was already sort of prefaced in the title, and that's the difference between an adaptation and a byproduct. I'm going to go fast on this, and there's a lot more nuance that can be added. You can look it up on your own time. But to get us started, simply an adaptation is some kind of a trait that has come about through an evolutionary process to solve a particular problem. Okay. So what are examples of these types of things? Well, humans walk upright. And at least as a conventional story goes, right, we're the only fully bipedal great ape. Walking on 2 feet. That walking on 2 feet, that bipedal, fully upright posture appears to be an adaptation. Well, what problem did it solve? Well, there are lots of candidates out there, but it may have had something to do with moving down out of the trees and being on the savanna and needing to sort of get up and look around long distances because we're not super fast or super strong and we need to be able to get back to the trees. Or to be able to then actually be able to walk and carry stuff at the same time, which is a pretty cool trick. But you can't do that if you're walking on all 4s. You can't carry stuff. All right. So that's the kind of thing that people look at that trait, that adaptation. It appears that being bipedal is an adaptation to solve particular kinds of fitness challenges, would be the language. A byproduct then is all the other stuff, okay, that doesn't arrive just because directly to solve a problem, but seems to be a spin-off. Let me give you a fun little example. There was a research program that was established in the Soviet Union looking at foxes and the selective breeding of foxes to make them domesticated. A little bit like dogs descended from wolves, it appears, through. Anyway, they tried to rush the process looking at foxes in particular and selectively bred foxes that seemed to be pretty comfortable around humans, that seemed to be a little more tame. Okay, and over subsequent generations then of this selective breeding, you end up with foxes that are very tame, very friendly. And in fact, you can buy these pets online now. Okay, you can buy these Siberian foxes. Well, their temperament is an adaptation to the selective pressure that humans applied to them, if you want to think of it that way. But an interesting byproduct is they often got floppy ears and curly tails. That's not what they were selected for. The people who were selectively breeding didn't say, you know what, we need some floppy-eared foxes. That wasn't it. Oh, it would be great if they had a curly tail because then I could grab them like a handle. No, nothing like that. It just was a byproduct of being really sort of nice around humans. Okay, and that's kind of a fun thing. And I'm using an example from foxes because in humans, it's really hard to tell whether something is a byproduct or a straight up adaptation. These things get mucky and blurry very quickly, especially, okay, so that was my first sort of key distinction, is adaptation versus byproduct, especially because of multi-level selection, which is our second key term, multi-level selection. Okay, this happens in other species as well, but in humans, it's particularly important that it appears not only does evolution work on our individual genetic level in terms of our individual fitness, but it may work in terms of our group fitness as well. Okay, whether certain groups of people are successful, and it can do these at the same time. So the group level kinds of dynamics change the selective pressure on the individual level dynamics in many cases. Textbook example of this that you will be able to learn more about if you're interested is lactose tolerance in adults. Okay, you may not know it, but only about 25% of the world's population are tolerant to consuming lactose as adults. That is, drink milk as a grown-up, right? Babies do it, no problem. But most babies in most parts of the world lose that ability as they grow older. But there are some strange people, descended mostly of Europeans, who can drink milk as adults. How did that happen? Well, it looks like there was a mutation in a gene that allows for longer range, adult metabolism of lactose. But it became adaptive due to a change in the social environment. The change in the social environment was raising dairy animals. Okay, so there was a cultural change, dairy animals, which now make milk consumption as an adult awfully handy to be able to pull off. If you didn't have dairy animals, it wouldn't matter if you could drink milk as an adult because you just wouldn't get any. So a cultural change then changes the selection pressure on individual fitness. And so now you've got this weird gene culture complex that has evolved, okay, together. So that's what I mean by multi-level selection, where you've got this weird kind of two things going on at once. And it's a group level thing because it's not that individuals sort of are choosing to raise dairy cattle or not. It's entire communities that are raising dairy cattle, right? But if a big enough proportion of the people in your community can't drink milk, you're never going to do it as a culture and vice versa. So they play off of each other. Okay. You with me? At least good enough? All right. So second big distinction, multi-level selection, which has led us to third, what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis. Okay. Extended evolutionary synthesis. This is still fairly controversial stuff out there in the world. If you want to read more, Kevin Leyland and at St. Andrews and some of his colleagues have done some nice writing on this. The basic idea here is that the old simple Darwinian model, especially as applied to humans, is too simple. We need to start paying attention to group level cultural influences on selection, what's called epigenetics, right? That certain kinds of environmental changes regulate whether or not certain genes are going to be expressed. That old simple, what used to be called the neo-Darwinian synthesis of genes plus Darwinism is maybe too simple to solve certain kinds of problems. Back to lactose tolerance is a great example because it's not just that you need the gene to be able to pull off lactose metabolism as an adult. You need to continue to be exposed to it, or you start losing the ability to metabolize this stuff comfortably, as some of you may know, right? If you stop drinking milk at a certain point and then go back to it, you go, oh, okay, that doesn't feel so good. Because you start losing it, right? Because you're an entire biological system in a cultural system. All right. Don't have enough time to talk about extended evolutionary synthesis, but I raised these sort of these three kinds of distinctions: adaptation versus byproduct, multi-level selection, and extended evolutionary synthesis, mostly to sound very scientific. Okay, no, that's not why. Because they are, you see threads of these in all of these new scientific explanations of religious thought and expression, all right, thought and behavior. Okay, they show up there. And depending on which one you emphasize, then whether or not you should believe in God or the ancestors may change a little bit. I'm not so sure, but I want you to at least have those tools in your pocket. There's a fourth, and I'll count it this weird way to say that this one is like but different than the others. This fourth distinction is proper versus actual domain for cognitive mechanisms. Proper versus actual domain. This is a little different, but it's related to the others. The idea here is that human minds have systems for processing certain types of information, some of which have evolved as adaptations. Or you might think they work most naturally in a particular context to solve particular problems. But that doesn't mean they can't be used in other spaces. Okay, So it may be that we evolved these really strong opposable thumbs, which is, other animals have opposable thumbs, but ours have this really nice meaty muscle right here, and they're really strong at grabbing stuff. And maybe the proper domain from an evolutionary perspective for that big thumb is tool use, right? For picking things up, for throwing things, for doing all kinds of interesting dexterous stuff. That's the proper domain. But the actual domain is anywhere that thing can do good work, including playing musical instruments, for instance. That would be the actual domain, would include musical instruments and other kinds of tool use, but maybe it didn't evolve for musical instruments. That's just an extension. Or in another example is we've got this great little part of our brain that's good at processing human faces. And from infancy, babies come out of the womb, they're already selectively attending to faces in the environment. That's pretty cool. The actual domain for that device is human faces, it sure looks like. But the proper domain is human faces. The actual domain is broader than that. Okay, it includes animated faces, stick drawings of faces, big circles with a line. And this has been studied. I mean, you can show this. Babies will selectively attend to circles over a line, but not the other way around. Okay, and it appears to be facilitated by the same part of the brain. Okay, you with me? Okay, so there's this, what the cognitive system evolved for, and then there's how it actually gets used. So proper domain, actual domain. All right. What's kind of interesting is sometimes it's better in the actual domain in things that were not part of the proper domain. And faces is another good example. Okay, so it looks like while we've got this device that's good for picking out and distinguishing lots of different faces, it's even better at what are sometimes called superstimuli, exaggerated faces, like we see in masks, where the eyes are a little bigger than they should be, and the mouths are a little bigger. Or Disney animation does this, right? So you watch Tangled, you go, holy cow, her eyes are too big. But our cognitive system that detects faces just goes crazy on that. It says, yes, 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 face, 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 face. Because it's super stimuli, right? It exaggerates what makes faces distinctive compared to everything else. It accentuates the signal noise discrimination in that system, okay? All right, 4 key concepts or distinctions. Now we're gonna get to the real meat here, all right? 3 French hens. How do you know that's real meat? Because those are tasty birds. I mean, because they lay eggs, and that means they're always fruitful. They're always producing. So remember those French, oh, where are the French hens? French hens, there they are. Look at those beautiful golden birds. I actually have chickens in my backyard garden here. I have 6 hens. They're not laying yet, they're too young. But 3 French hens, 3 ways to stay religious thought and practice. These are approaches that have been used, are being used, and they have proven to be really handy and useful, okay? The first are adaptationist approaches. Adaptationist approaches. These are approaches that say, look, there's something about a religious concept, belief, practice that is an adaptation in and of itself. It has evolved to solve a particular problem. And natural selection or group selection or multi-level selection or extended evolutionary synthesis has brought about that adaptation. There's sort of the old version of these and the new version. I'll just tell you about the new version. Some of the better ones I think have to do with, for instance, what's called hard to fake signaling. So anthropologist Richard Sosis at the University of Connecticut has done some really great work on this. Demonstrating in lots of ways and then theorizing around those demonstrations that groups of people that go through certain kinds of rituals together end up more cooperative with each other. Okay, so, excuse me, corporate praying, for instance, makes people trust each other more, it looks like, and then they're more cooperative. And initiation rituals that sort of, bring you into a group seem to do a really handy job of bonding people together. And if that's right, then we might think that communities that have those kinds of rituals will outcompete other communities. And so then their cultural systems and their gene pool outcompete other groups. And so over time, you get more of those. So people who do rituals outperform people who don't do rituals. And then over time, you get more groups of people who do rituals because they're the sort of dominant, both genetic and sort of cultural model. Kind of with me? All right. Okay. There's less certainty now. All right. So, for instance, Richard Sosis has studied kibbutz communities in Israel, which are these little communes that were set up. Many of them secular, but many of them religious. And he asked people to engage in what are called economic games, which have been used by a lot of people as an indication of level of trust. In these games, you often, as a participant, are given so much money, say 10 pounds. And you have to decide whether you're going to share some of that money with someone else, trusting that they will share their money with you too. Put it in the common pool. Because and the rules of the game are, if you both put into the common pool grows. And so you get more out of it, but not if the other person cheats. If the other person doesn't put in and you did, you just lose. But if you both pull out, neither of you get as much. So, and there are different variations on these. They're called economic games, and you can look up the different variations. Richard Sosis used these to look at the level of trust within these communities. So people were asked to basically play economic games with other members of their kibbutz communities. And what they found was, yes, the religious communities were more trusting than the non-religious ones. And that level of trust was predicted statistically by the frequency with which they prayed together. Okay. And that's just one study, but there are lots of other examples that he and his collaborators and other lab groups have looked at. Okay. We know that actually doing synchronized ritualized behaviors with people, at least we think we know, leads to endorphin releases, which then leads to warm feelings, sort of, more trust and everything else with people. Some labs are suggesting oxytocin is a major sort of bonding chemical that actually gets activated in ritual circumstances. Okay, all of this then contributes to an account of ritual behavior being an adaptation to solve social problems, okay, in humans, which is a fascinating hypothesis. These kinds of accounts, adaptationist accounts, then, are pretty good at accounting for why we see some of the social dynamics and functional dynamics we see in religious systems. That's what they're focused on. What they're not focused on is, yeah, but why gods? Why ancestors? Why spirits? They're not quite as focused on that. So that's, I hesitate to call that a criticism because that's not what they're trying to explain. They're trying to explain these sort of functional dynamics. But the second of my French hens, byproduct approaches often focus on the content. Okay, so adaptationist approaches, now byproduct approaches. In byproduct approaches, the thinking goes this way. Look, humans have all of these cognitive gadgets in their heads that evolved to solve lots of different problems. And an interesting byproduct of how those things work seems to be religious ideas. Okay, how would that go? Well, Pascal Boyer was one of the sort of founding fathers of this approach, proposed quite some time ago that, and some experimental evidence has backed it up now, that concepts that are too complex, too counterintuitive, that run against the way that our minds naturally work are just hard to transmit. They're hard to think, they're hard to communicate to other people, and so they're unlikely to spread in a population and become stabilized. But there are ideas that are fairly intuitive. In fact, we even think them without knowing that we're thinking them. Like if I tell you that the manabee at the local zoo has had babies, you will assume naturally that they are baby manabees and not some other kind of animal. You will probably also assume that the manna bee moves itself around in order to obtain nutrition. You will probably also assume that the manna bee is not made of mechanical parts. And I could go on and on. That if I threw the manna bee against the wall, it won't pass right through it. That it'll actually go thud and fall to the ground, okay? Those are assumptions that are in the background all the way, that conceptual space that's just filled in automatically by our intuitions, naturally occurring intuitions. And developmental studies have shown that a lot of these intuitions are common across cultures. Okay, you can think of it as this sort of common core of sort of intelligence about the natural world that we just have by virtue of being human beings, okay? Living in typical kind of human environments. And so ideas like that manna bee that are sort of intuitive are easy to think about, they're easy to talk about, but they're pretty boring. Who cares? What's maybe more interesting, especially for young adults, it appears, and adolescents, are ideas that are pretty standard, pretty intuitive, but they've got a little tweak. They're what we call minimally counterintuitive. Okay, they've got something interesting about it, like an invisible manna bee. Ooh, now that's interesting. Okay, now that I can get behind. Oh, a manna bee that actually gave birth to puppies. Yeah, dogs. Okay, wait a minute, what? Okay, now you've got my attention. Oh, by the way, I made up manna bee, there's no such thing. And you knew a lot about it anyway. That was the point, okay? So minimally counterintuitive concepts, or modestly counterintuitive concepts, especially about minded, intentional beings, seem to hit a kind of sweet spot. Our minds are naturally, at least when we're younger, our minds are naturally attracted to them. We want to think about them. We want to think about invisible beings or trees that listen to us. Or, I don't know, immortal beings. They capture our attention naturally, it appears, okay, because they hit this kind of sweet spot. And it looks like at least a lot of religious material, but not all, and not only religious material, but a lot of those religious concepts fit that kind of sweet spot space. Well, that's a byproduct view. It's not that our minds gravitate towards these to solve a particular adaptive problem. It's that because of all of the other things that our minds naturally do well, these kind of bubble to the top in a lot of contexts. Okay, but there's more to the byproduct story. Because you might already be thinking, well, wait a minute, that can't be it. That doesn't separate sci-fi from religious concepts or just fantasy and folk tales. And yeah, you're right, there's more to it than that. And the more to it is always developing. But some of the more to it is this. Deborah Kellerman is a developmental psychologist at Boston University, has shown over the last about 20 years of research across cultures with lots of kids, that it looks like we naturally, and I should say adults recently, we naturally, just as human beings again, are drawn to the idea that things we see in the natural world are the product of design and purpose. Okay, she calls this teleofunctional reasoning. So if you ask a kid why it is that rocks are pointy, they are attracted to explanations that have some kind of purpose or function behind them, like so that animals won't sit on them to crush them. They don't much care for explanations that are mechanistic, like, well, because bits of stuff piled up over time. Think sort of stalagmite style. Nah. So you won't sit on it. Why does the giraffe have a long neck? So that it can reach the high leaves. Okay, makes sense to me. Sounds good. Because it's a functional kind of explanation, or purposeful. Okay. It turns out we naturally see design and purpose in the world around us. And so then, if one of these minimally counterintuitive concepts fits with that little conceptual anchor point, oh, there's a creator God. Oh, all right, makes sense to me. There's something naturally satisfying about that. The conceptual space that is a byproduct of the way that our minds naturally work has a cultural input that sort of fits well. Okay. the story goes on and on and on. There are lots of different little cognitive mechanisms that have been suggested for why, what makes the byproducty stuff work. Again, it's an ongoing thing, but I hope you're getting the picture that we've got these sort of cognitive devices in our heads, if you will, that, at least under the standard account, evolved for other reasons. As a byproduct of them, we have these little conceptual spaces that are looking for appropriate input. And many of the concepts that we call religious concepts, including God concepts, seem to have a really happy home in those spaces, those conceptual spaces. Okay? All right, that's a byproducty approach. That's my second French hen. Third French hen, because it's been very productive, laying lots of eggs, okay? The third French hen that is also starting to lay eggs, this one's newer, are hybrid models. Okay, they're kind of hybrid multi-level approaches that combine adaptationist features and byproduct features. Okay, adaptationist features, really good at functions because of adaptation. Byproduct, pretty good at the conceptual stuff, the substance of religious beliefs. Well, how can we put those together? Well, some folks are starting to find ways to do that. And usually it goes along the lines of, well, for byproducty reasons, human minds naturally gravitate towards ideas like there are invisible beings that account for some of the natural stuff we see in the world around us. Maybe they're forest spirits, or maybe they're creator gods. But once we have beliefs in those that have started to arise in a cultural context, if we start doing rituals around them, then we get the benefit of having engaged in these ritual systems that make us then bonded together. Okay. Or Dominic Johnson down at Oxford has shown that cultures that have gods of war have outcompeted historically cultures that don't have gods of war on a cultural sort of selection basis. But he didn't say where those gods of war came from. Oh, well, that byproducty stuff. So you can kind of start putting these accounts together to account for broader systems and patterns. Okay. Adaptationist approaches, byproduct approaches, hybrid approaches, or multi-level approaches. All right. Those are my three French heads. Okay, I know I'm going fast. There are more lectures online that you can find later, as well as things you can read. But I want you to at least have these categories in mind. Okay, now we can move to our turtle doves. I don't know what the point of turtle doves is. They coo a lot. They probably make a mess. But I think they make more noise than they are functional. And that's kind of what I want to represent here, is two kinds of arguments against religious beliefs from the sciences. Those are my two turtle doves. They're actually much less menacing than you might think. Okay, two types of arguments against religious beliefs from these kind of scientific approaches. The first is by way of suspect origins, I'm going to call it, by way of suspect origins. And the way you'll hear this talked about comes in a variety of packages, but they often go this way. My faith is just a byproduct of evolution. Or my faith is just an adaptation. Or probably more accurately, your faith is just an adaptation. Your faith is just a byproduct of evolution. Or here's one of, as a developmental, someone who's done lots of developmental science, it's kind of childish, isn't it? Religious beliefs, because they arise through these sort of early developing cognitive mechanisms that we see in childhood, like that Deb Kellerman stuff. Yeah, children see design and purpose everywhere. We can outgrow that. All right. So all of these kinds of arguments are by way of suspect origins. Now, how does the argument go? Well, it must go something like this. You believe in X. X arises because of an evolved capacity. An evolved capacity is not aimed at truth. It's aimed at something being adaptive, right? It's fitness enhancing, not truth aimed. So you don't really have good reason to believe it after all. Do you follow me? Okay. You believe X because it's an adaptation. Adaptations aren't about truth. They're about solving fitness problems. Okay. Because it's about solving a fitness problem, not about being truth aimed, you don't have any good reason to believe X. All right. And put in the X, whatever you want. And the reason I put it that way is because that's one way to evaluate the argument is, can we slip in X? And does it change how we feel about that argument depending on how we slip in X? So if I said, you believe that your mother loves you because it was adaptive for children to think that their mothers love them, that's just a product of evolution. Now that we know this, do you want to revise your position? At least as I was seeing, probably most of us would probably think, well, I'm not so sure I'm ready to revise my position on that. I mean, if she tells me I hate you, yeah, then we might revise our position. But just pointing out that there's some kind of evolutionary origin probably isn't enough. And why isn't it enough? Well, because we can tell this evolutionary story about all kinds of things that look to be patently true. And we can tell it about things that are false. It sure doesn't look like it matters one way or the other, at least on its face. We'll have to do better than that. Likewise with byproduct accounts. Your faith is just a byproduct. Notice I slipped in that word just. Well, that was cheating. I should just say it's a byproduct. Well, what do we know about byproducts? They're not adaptations. That's it. So believing that 2 times 7 is 14, or I guess you say R14, huh? 2 times 7, R14. It's been a while. How do you say it? I mean, no, is, R? What's grammatical here? It's so hard. Anyway, 2 times 4 equals 14. Well, that's your knowledge of that and how you've come to it was based on cognitive systems that did not evolve to do that level of mathematics. Byproduct. So calling it a byproduct, does that make you think, okay, wait a minute, I better wait on that 2 times 7 thing? I don't know. Okay, you might say I'm cheating. That one's too obvious. Well, here's one. Commonly around the world, we think other people have consciousness, conscious minds, and unified selves. Okay, that's a pretty standard thing to believe. I haven't heard a compelling reason why we think that's an evolved capacity. It may be an adaptation to think that other people have beliefs and emotional states, but not a centralized mind that's unified in any interesting sense. And yet, here we are all believing it as a byproduct of our evolution. Well, just identifying it as a byproduct, even if that turns out to be true, does that mean we should just stop thinking other people have these unified conscious selves? Minds? Suddenly, no one else has a mind? It seems a little hasty. So my point is that with these kinds of suspect origins sort of explanations, we got to do a lot better than just saying, it came from a byproduct, or, it came from an adaptation. Or even it came from childhood, because the reason we have lots of ideas that are early developing in childhood is because they're really handy to have around. Okay, so just because it's childish doesn't make it wrong. Most of our fundamentals, including the things I was just talking about, are things that arise in childhood. So let's not be mean to kids just yet. They do believe some weird stuff, but not nearly as weird as adult philosophers believe sometimes. Come on, if we're honest, right? There aren't any philosophers on the, just playing. All right, so suspect origin is our first turtle dove. Our second turtle dove is suspect causation. This one is more interesting, I think. And it goes something like this. It plays off of an intuition that to have beliefs that we should feel good about, they need to be connected to a causal object the right way. So if I believe I'm talking to other people right now, I need other people causing me to have that belief. Having taken a pill that makes me think I'm talking to other people right now is not the right causal pathway for forming that belief. If I believe that there is tea in here, the tea needs to be causing that belief, right? There needs to be a causal, you're with me? I mean, it's a weird philosopher kind of way to talk about this, but that's how we normally function in life. How do you know that there's tea in there? Because I can taste it. How do you know you're tasting tea? Because the tea contacted my tongue. Okay, and then releases chemicals into my olfaction, and then that leads me to this impression of tea that I have from a memory. That's how we all think, right, in day-to-day life. Just as nerdy as that, right? No? Okay, but you see, there needs to be a causal connection between what it is that we formed a belief about and the belief itself, at least in most cases, right? And so you might think, well, then, using that kind of rule, if these fancy science guys come up with these explanations for why it is people have a belief in God or an ancestor spirit or ghosts that does not appeal to those ghosts, spirits, or gods actually acting in the real world, we should be suspect. That is, if the account doesn't seem to care one way or another whether it's true, but you would believe anyway, that should make us a little more nervous, right? If I believe that there's tea in my coffee cup here, even if it was water or coffee or wine, well, I shouldn't be so confident that I actually have tea in here. Okay, you with me? No yawning. That's not, no. I know it's late for you, but still, come on, dial that back. All right. But maybe the case isn't quite as analogous as that first seems. Okay, maybe it's not the case that when I look at a mountain, beautiful mountain at sunrise or something like that, and I'm just impressed with God's presence. Maybe I'm not seeing God, and so there isn't the right causal connection. Maybe there is something about my psychology that sets me up to draw an inference from, maybe a hasty inference from those moments. Okay, maybe that's right, but is that so unlike the inferences we often make in regular life? Let me give you an example from a colleague of mine, a friend, based on a true story of someone I know in the UK who once received a letter that claimed to be from Buckingham Palace. Okay, and in the letter, it was in really shabby shape too, this letter when it arrived, all messy and stuff. The letter claimed that the Queen wanted to knight him for his contributions to science. Okay, that a knighthood was in order. Well, it wasn't the Queen who was there at his door. It was this piece of paper that just, yeah, okay, it's got a seal on it, looks like it's from the Queen and all this, but still, the Queen is not causally interacting with me in a direct fashion, okay, or with him. And so he was skeptical. He thought, nah, I'm not so sure. This seems more likely to be the kind of prank that my students would play on me. And so ignored it, left it in a pile and went away. And until he got a phone call some weeks later saying, you haven't responded to our correspondence. And then he started thinking, well, okay, they're really going hard on this prank. Long story short, it turns out it was from Buckingham Palace, and he was knighted eventually. Knighted by whom? The Queen. But the Queen didn't directly lead to his belief that he was going to be knighted. She indirectly did through a series of causal events. Okay? She has organized a committee that helps select people who will be knighted for things like this. Those people make a selection. They tell somebody to send a letter and so forth and so on. And that gets delivered via post. And you see there's a long causal chain. Well, why couldn't it be that the way that our minds have either evolved through their adaptations or the byproducts we have don't have that indirect causal chain back to a creator God who made us this way, so that we would have a natural receptivity to the idea that there's design and order in the world around us. Things seem to happen for reasons. The best explanation for these kinds of reasons that we have is some kind of agency, intelligence. It's easy for us to think about. It's easy for us to communicate about. So we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses who keep reinforcing that idea to us. Why couldn't a God sort of build into the creation those kinds of naturally occurring biases and predilections that at least incline us, start moving us in the direction of thinking that there's someone else out there that's not just us, that helps order and make sense of the world around us? Maybe that's the situation that we're looking at with these scientific explanations, byproduct or evolutionary explanations of religious beliefs and practices. And that's my partridge in the pear tree. Is the big takeaway then is I actually don't see a particular problem yet. I think that the science is neutral with regard to whether or not we should believe, based on, you know, whether it's byproduct or adaptation. Doesn't seem to matter too much. But there are theological grounds, I think, for thinking that it's reasonable to think that God might organize a world in such a way. And that should be sort of exciting and pique our curiosity to keep exploring these possible questions. Well, then, how did God do it? How do we encourage that? How do we discourage it from going in the wrong direction? So my partridge in a big pear tree, my big takeaway is, I think that depending on what worldview you're bringing to this, remember that was number 4 interpretations. What you're going to do with it, interpretation, has to do with your worldview. And if you're bringing certain theological resources to the science, you should see, I think, that there's actually a pretty nice fit here. There's good reason to think this is the kind of thing that God might do. And we can get on with the science and see, oh, right, how did he do it? All right, so those are my prepared comments. And hopefully I left some time for question and answer.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Justin. I'm sure that is going to have raised loads of questions for people. So yeah, do get on that Slido if you've got questions and send them in. You can also upvote other people's questions. So if there are ones you particularly want answered, you can upvote them and get them answered. But we've got a couple come in already. We've got kind of 10 minutes to answer some of these. So I'll read them out and then you can answer them. So first of all, someone asks, why would God design people so that they're as likely to believe in other religious systems as in the true God?
That's a great question. Well, I'm not sure it's as likely, but let's take that. I'll go ahead and accept that. We don't know the likelihood, so I guess we would say it's inscrutable, as they say. We don't know the likelihood of believing one versus another. But why? Why would? Well, there are plenty of theological resources to answer these. First of all, we're not dealing with humans sort of in a pristine created state, however you want to think about that. We are dealing with humans in a fallen, muddy world where we persuade each other of all kinds of things. And while I am sympathetic to the idea that there's a lot of natural impetus towards us having beliefs of a certain sort, I'm not a determinist about this. I don't think it's the case that we're wired to believe these things and somehow we can't change that. Okay, so that's to say there are all of these cultural forces that are also influencing what we believe. And those may make it look like some systems are, or some beliefs are more attractive than God, the true God. So I guess I'm sort of poking at two things. One is, yeah, I don't think that God created us with a fully formed, fully fleshed idea of him in our heads that we could not rebel from. We could not be messed up by our parents. We could not be messed up by our society. That's not the claim. If he did that to us, I think it would be coercive, okay, and not helpful. For some reason, God seems to operate in such a way that he gives us all of these freedoms to choose our lives, to do terrible things, and to think things that aren't right too. Okay, so that's one point. The second point is, I think we, especially Protestants, often put too much pressure on what we need to know about God versus what we need to do about it. I like to give the example of a little friend of mine who loves me very much and has his whole life. He's 5 years old now. I've known him since birth. And it's clear when he was a 2-year-old that he loved me. He didn't know much about me. And you don't need to. You need to know enough. And I think there's something analogous in our knowledge of God. God needs to give us enough to send us seeking for him, toward him, but not so much that we're sort of bullied into sort of, but those are my quick thoughts on a very good and very complicated question.
Great, thanks. Next question is up here. If at the beginning of our societies, it was advantageous to believe in the same gods as everyone else, how evolutionarily would unbelief arise and then spread?
Good. It's probably the case that there have always been at least some people in societies who have been a little bit skeptical about what's going on. They've always been there. So I don't know how old non-belief is, but there's an interesting thing about belief that psychologists have been increasingly showing, and is belief is motivated. We talk about motivated cognition. And this is a really important concept in this day and age. Okay. The idea is that we don't just, in a sort of cold, calculating manner, weigh the evidence and arrive at a conclusion. Rather, we weigh the evidence in a way that fits certain, well, how we want it to come out sometimes. It's just true. Okay. Professional philosophers evaluate arguments that they're inclined to agree with as better arguments than their opponents' arguments. Scientists think that the evidence for their claims is better than their opponents' claims. That's one of the reasons that it's important that science is social and that we have this sort of exchange, because we're really bad at finding mistakes in our own reasoning. We're really good at finding mistakes in other people's reasoning. Really smart people are more likely to find problems with certain kinds of claims than sort of the people who don't know this stuff. We are motivated to believe certain things. Okay, is the big point. Motivated cognition, look it up. How does that bear? Well, it's not the case that they're just some people are like, I believe, I don't believe. But behind us is a complex of our entire psychology and what that belief is meaning to us. What's its signal to believe or not believe? Socially, who's going to accept me if I believe or not believe? Okay, so that's the bigger picture of belief. Now, why might atheism rise? For any of those reasons, but also it could be that we've had these very powerful kind of social forces that are moving people around. In some cases, it's been coerced, right? Under the Soviet Union and communist China, unbelief has been coerced. There's no doubt about that. In some parts of Europe, it's been more sort of apathetic atheism, right? Where it's a little more passive atheism. It's like, I just don't see the use in all of this stuff. Why not? Well, these are very peculiar societies that have built up immense sort of social support systems through the government. Government has managed to take the place of religious traditions and communities in many cases. There's been this bonus in the last 150 years in that we've got natural selection helping to say, here's another way of thinking about why there's design and purpose that we see in the world. Oh, it evolved that way. We've got evolution by natural selection. And if we listen to some popularizers of it, it's natural selection is practically a god, right? It has intents and purposes. It'll give us morality, all of these incredible ascientific kinds of things. That fits that conceptual space because it's been forced in there in a way. Now, I'm not making any comment one way or the other about whether or not atheism is rational. But one final little detail, it's not as common as you think. Okay, even if you, at least the thoroughgoing naturalist kind of atheism. Interesting thing, in the UK over the last 35 years, as people have been leaving the churches and atheism is going up, so is belief in ghosts, spirits, and the occult. All right. So there are plenty of people who don't believe in God, so they're atheists, but believe in ghosts and they believe in spirits. So that's what I mean by it's a little more complicated than it first appears. All right, I said too much. Sorry. We gotta go be quick. We gotta be quick.
Sure. Next question on here that I think is a great one. What can we say about morality from an evolutionary perspective? Are our moral instincts a byproduct of evolution?
Good question. And it's a great parallel case to all those questions you've been asking. It parallels very nicely. So it appears that, at least one leading account is that we do have something like these sort of evolved moral foundations. So Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory says that we've got these kind of cognitive, emotional little engines that generate certain intuitions about what's right and wrong. And those undergird our moral thinking across cultures. They lead us to the intuition that some things really are right and some things really are wrong. Okay, what would be an example? Don't harm other people. See, in your group anyway, don't harm your in-group. Seems to be a cross-culturally recurrent kind of theme. So is don't cheat or cheat members of your in-group. All right, be fair in your exchanges. Respect authority. Be loyal to your group, and don't do disgusting things. Okay, those are the five of the big foundations that have been suggested, and lots of our moral reasoning seems to spin out of those and gets culturally modified for particular cases. What counts as disgusting? It's got a little bit of wiggle room. Who counts as my in-group? That has some wiggle room that I should be loyal to. Culture even can sort of suppress some of these intuitions, like say, no, question authority, fight the power. All right. Or drawing new loyalty boundaries. We should be loyal to humanity, not to my clan or group, all of humanity, however it gets played out. So culture can interact with these, but it does seem like there are these little evolved anchors, at least it's been suggested. But notice they're a little bit like, if they're true, let's accept for a moment that they are, they're a little bit like these religious anchors I was talking about. They don't deliver clear morality. They deliver tendencies, moral tendencies, intuitions that then we build upon. Much like the evolved cognition doesn't seem to deliver the God, the true God concept. It delivers a sense that there's design and purpose, that there's kind of justice in the world, that things happen for a reason and someone is a better explanation than no one, that there must have been an origin of some sort, that weird things that happened probably did happen for a reason. Oh, I think I said that one already, and so forth and so on. And then the particulars get developed culturally. So if we're concerned that, well, our moral intuition, I'll put it this way. So we might leverage the same kinds of arguments to moral intuitions as we did those religious ones, because they're very parallel kinds of cases. So if we find out there's an evolution to the idea that you shouldn't club babies over the head, that there's some evolutionary kind of origin, should we suddenly go, oh no, I guess it's all right then because it's evolved, or it's a byproduct, so club away. No, right? We wouldn't go there. Anyway, you can tell I could go on a long time with these things. All right, sorry.
Sure. I think I'm going to say we've got time for one last question. So the question here, and then I've got an extra bit to it. The question is, do you believe that some people have more of an ability to believe in God than others from a psychological perspective? Yes, maybe what I want to add to that is then how would you address the friend who says, oh, it's great that you believe, but I'm not wired that way. That's your thing, not mine.
Good. Yeah. So two-part question. Is it the case? And then what do you do about it if it is? Is it the case? I'm pretty confident it is. That some people really due to their their upbringing, their social environment, whatever it is, they find it easier to believe than other people. I think that's almost surely the case. And then what do you do about it? Well, before we get to the what you do about it, note that variance in our natural dispositions cuts across all kinds of domains. Some of us just find it a lot easier to be kind than other people, to express empathy and sympathy. We have natural tendencies to be more or less violent, especially those of us with Y chromosomes. I mean, it's rough. It's, poor us, right? No, I mean, really, we're more dangerous. It's just on average. So yeah, I expect that there is variability. So then what do you do about it? Well, just because we have a natural tendency in a particular direction doesn't somehow make us no longer morally culpable with what we do that is within our control. Right? Just because I have a tendency to be a jerk doesn't mean it's okay for me to continue to be a jerk. And it doesn't mean I'm helpless in that regard. What do I need to do? Well, maybe I should surround myself with people who show me another way of behaving. And over time, that's going to build up my sort of anti-jerk kinds of tendencies. Maybe I need to actually do a little bit of work of changing my mindset, which I still have power to do. Maybe I should, in the case of, say, in a lot of religious communities, right? If you have doubt, what did Blaise Pascal suggest? Basically, act as if you don't have doubt. Why? Because part of how we form our beliefs and our commitments and our values is through action. It's not just our beliefs guide our actions and our feelings, but our feelings and actions drive our beliefs as well. So we can put ourselves into situations in which we are encouraged to think certain ways. So when I hear the person say, I'd love to believe in God, I just can't do it. Like, well, if you really would love to believe, there are things you can do. You can actually start engaging a community of believers and being part of it. You can actually start praying. What? But I don't believe. God doesn't care. Go ahead, give it a try. Because we do act ourselves into belief as much as we believe ourselves into action. So I guess that's what I would say. To a couple of nods and mostly puzzled looking faces. But
yeah, that was so helpful. I think I can't see everyone's faces because I've got you all on speaker view. But Justin, thank you so much. That's all we've got time for. But usually we'd be able to show our appreciation like with a round of applause, but maybe we can all send the clapping emoji instead. And that's the best we can do.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's
fun to spend time with you.
Oh, we're really grateful for you making time in your week, and especially calling in from many, many miles away. Isn't it a wonderful thing that it allows us to be possible?
It's fantastic, yeah.
So this is our last event of term. So thanks so much to everyone who's come along to any of these Science Network events this term. I'm planning some exciting things for the new year, which I'm hoping to be able to share with you soon. But something that would be really helpful is if you've been along to just today or more of these events, just drop me a little email, like letting me know how you found it, what's been great, what you think we can improve on for the future. If there's things about Zoom, things about timing, things about topics that you'd love to see happen next term, you can get hold of me at science@uccf.org.uk, or I think most of you will be able to find me on Facebook, so just drop me a message. That would be really, really helpful. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing the stuff we've got coming up next term with you. But for now, I guess it's probably late enough in the year to say Happy Christmas. I hope you all have a lovely Christmas holiday and you make it home safely if you're not there already. And yeah, looking forward to being in touch in the new year. See you all soon.